Well, new research has revealed that Labor and Greens voters are more easily swayed than Liberals. Just half of Labor supporters say they're pretty certain to vote for the party. That's compared to two-thirds of Liberal voters. So what does this say about support for the parties ahead of next year's federal election? Joining me now is Redbridge Group Director Simon Welsh. Simon, interesting research this week.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. That's right. We went out and we looked at firmness of vote, certainty of vote amongst particularly those three major parties. And yeah, it's fascinating. So what we found was, as you said in the introduction, that Labor voters are sort of 50-50. It's a very even split of those that are sort of, rusted on, ready to vote Labor, and those that are saying, look, I'm still making up my mind, I'm still considering, I'm by no means certain. I'm only sort of leaning that way at the moment. The Liberal voters were much more, about two-thirds, one-third sort of split. So that's a significant...
15-16% difference between the two major parties there. And I think there's a few things going on here. I think what we're seeing on the Liberal Party vote is, I think, the economic conditions. If you're a Liberal voter, even if you sort of lean a bit Liberal, I think the current economic climate really gives you a permission to vote Liberal and to stay Liberal. I think that headwind is certainly sort of blowing for them at the moment, as opposed to blowing for the government. I think on the Labor poll, when you then dive into that headline result with a little bit more detail, what you find is it's really driven by younger voters, particularly those under the age of about 35 and even below the age of 40. I think what's happening there is we've seen some really interesting shifts in the focus groups recently around housing. Housing has become the issue amongst that voter cohort. And what we've seen is probably 6 months ago, you talk to those voters about housing and you sort of say, who's responsible for housing? And they would say, well, that's part of the problem. It's complicated. It's the market. It's state government, it's federal government, it's even local government. Some folk are even sort of aware of that role. But it's complicated. What's happened in these last few months is you ask that same question now and you get a resounding federal government answer. So, and you sort of dig into that and you ask them why, and it's, it's a national crisis. It needs a national response. And I think also just the fact that federal politics, there's been a lot of talk about housing on both sides of sort of left and right divide. You've got the Greens talking about it a lot, which of course reaches into this younger cohort particularly. But you've also got, One Nation talking about migration and housing. So you've got this massive discussion around housing at the federal level. And I think that's really sort of planted the flag for this younger cohort about where they're expecting the response to come from. And I suspect that's what's really driving this particular acute problem that Labor has with younger voters in terms of their certainty of vote.
Yeah, okay. So, I mean, we've seen this supermarket cost of living inquiry going on at the moment. Is it all still about the cost of living?
Absolutely. But housing is part of that. Housing is part of that discussion. It's because if you're renting or you've got a mortgage right now, that's a big chunk of money that's being taken out of your livable fund to just pay for your housing. So what has happened is that housing and cost of living have really merged in the here and now. Then when you sort of talk to people about their longer term, and not just young people, it can be middle-aged and older people too. You talk to them about the longer term. What are the things that they're worried about? Well, the cost of living thing, the interest rates will come down. It'll take time. We've eaten through all our savings and we've got lots of debt, and it'll take time, but we'll sort of survive this. But when we look to the longer term, what's driving the anxiety there is housing. Is whether it's for me, whether it's for my kids or even for my grandkids, people are really worried about where this next generation of kids are going to live. So even once we get through the current crisis where people are worried about what they're going to eat, we're still worried about where people are going to live. Like, this is pretty existential stuff in a country that is, sort of as wealthy and as lucky as Australia is. And up until recent years, having the idea that we'd have focus groups where people are talking about they're worried about what they're going to eat and where they're going to live just seemed mind-boggling. But here we are now, and it's a relatively mainstream discussion.